Hi, Stefan, the BMW DIY guy. My project today is going to be the Avin Android 8.1 10¼ inch screen upgrade into my BMW F3X. Now, I'm actually going to be swapping out for their previous 7.1 inch or 7.1 Android display that I had in previously. But even if you're coming from the OEM screen, the instructions and the process is about the same. So you can use this video whether you're swapping out from a previous version or you're swapping out for the OEM screen. I'm excited for this update. This will bring Android up to 8.1. It also changes the display a little bit, adds some additional functionality and features, and I'm looking forward to getting this installed. So let's get out to the garage and get it installed. Okay, so we're out here in the car, and I'm going to be changing from the 7.1 to the 8.1 display. So obviously I've already got an Avin display in. So if you're following this video with the OEM display, it's essentially the same. I'm going to call it out. I'm also going to change my wiring harness because I already have this aftermarket wiring harness installed to support the 7.1 display. I'm going to take this wiring harness out and put in the new one because I do know that they change over time, so I'm not going to assume that the previous wiring harness is the same or wired the same for the new display. I wouldn't want to give myself any problems there. So if you're following this and you're taking the OEM screen out, it really isn't all that much different, all that much harder from what you're going to see. And I'll call out those differences as we go, because obviously you're going to add the new wiring harness and run the cabling up, or I'm going to need to pull that previous wiring harness out. But really not a big deal. So really simple start. So if you just grab your center trim and pull gently out. And as you pull this, pull down the body. Now at the very far end, now mine came out really nicely. It's just off screen. Very frequently, your trim at the far end will kind of snag. Make sure that you don't really pull and yard up on this and break that end off. That would be really inconvenient and really a pain. So you've got two cables here for your trim. You pull the center one, and I like to pull the buttons as well and pull that cable, because what you're going to want to do now, if your button is loose, you can push the button forward, which is what we're going to do when we reinstall. We're going to push the button forward to plug this cable back in, because getting this to fit in place is a bit of a pain. Pull it out of the clips, take your trim, set it someplace safely so you don't scratch it up or ding it up. Okay, so now you can see really what you're looking at. You've got this lower trim piece here that you pry down. You can pry down with your fingers or a plastic trim tool to get underneath it, and it'll just pry out. I've got the lighting here, so I'm going to pull this plug. You can also just sit it off to the side if it doesn't want to come out. There are times where this clip and this little lighting module can be a little fragile. I've seen these break. So mine came out a little violently, a little bit more violently than I would have liked. So be careful when you pull that, because if you pull this clip, or if you break this clip or break this light, that would really suck, because you'd lose your light down into your drink holders and your ashtray. I also have a little bit of extra cabling here that you'll see as I pull this all out that you may not have. I've added the LCI lighted trim. I have a pre-LCI model, so I've added the lighted trim, so I've got a little bit of extra wiring here, but not much. Okay, so you pull 6 T20 Torx, 1, 2, which secures the display, 3, 4 at the top part of this trim, 5, 6 at the bottom. You pull those, and then then this trim piece will come off, your screen will be loose, and you've got one cable on the back of this that secures this into place. So as you pull this off, just unplug that one cable and you can set this trim piece aside. So I'm going to do all that work so you don't have to see me unscrew a bunch of screws. So I'm going to pull those 6, and then I'll show you the next steps. I have all 6 out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They're all the same size, so it doesn't matter which ones go where when you put it back. This trim piece is now loose. It'll just pull off, and it's got one cable here on this back side that you can work out a little bit of the extra length. Now, I've got an extra cable in here that you may not have, which is here at the bottom, because like I said, I've got the lighted LCI trim, or if you have it, you'll have an extra cable here for the trim lighting, which, there we go, so that's out. And then this plug as well can be a little stubborn. Now, mine thankfully is loose, so it came right out. It can be a little stubborn sometimes. I've had it be really stubborn trying to get that out if you've never had it out before. Okay, so now we're looking at the head unit, which we're gonna need to pull and pull forward. One thing that I almost always do is that I cover my dash, and especially my shifter, anything like that, because the head unit is remarkably heavy for its size. It's a big, heavy metal unit. You've got 4 T20s that secure this in place, because you're going to have to pull this out and slide it forward. Now, as you do all this work, you're never going to take it out completely, because there are a ton of cables on the back. All of your antennas and your data feeds, your optical feeds, everything else, along with the big main plug that you're going to pull, that the daughter cable, that new daughter cable is going to go onto. And again, these are the same size as the others, so you can just put them all together. Don't lose them or drop them into your dash. You drop these, they can disappear and you'll never find them again. I've had 20-minute jobs take me 2 hours because I dropped a screw into my console and I spend the rest of the time fishing around with a light and a magnet, and it's not a lot of fun. So as you take these out, be careful. Try not to drop them. Okay, so I've got those 4 out. I've only got 1 rag in the car right now. That's okay. But protect your gear shifter, whether you got an automatic or a manual. So I'm gonna try to get my gear shifter out of the way a little bit. So just take this and just slide it forward, and it's gonna come out with all of those cables across the back. Now the other thing I really wanna do is protect my carbon fiber trim. I do not wanna scratch that or ding it up. So I've got some cable length that I've got to pull down and pull around to get this loose to be able to turn it on its side. And it can just sit here for now, because this is going to give me all the access I need to get to the back. Now, the difference between OEM and if you were pulling out something else. Now, OEM, you will just have this plug that basically comes up. It'll look like this. It'll come up out of your lower, all your wiring harnesses down below, and will attach to the back of the head unit. It has a horseshoe collar. So this is the back of your head unit, like this. It has this horseshoe collar that you pull down and back, and it'll unlock the collar, and then it'll pull away. And that's what you're going to want to do. Now, the other thing that we're going to look at today as well is changing and splitting off my headliner microphone for the microphone on the Android side. Now, if you notice, this isn't a splitter, it's an adapter. So I'm going to be able to pull the microphone feed that's plugged into my head unit, plug it in here, and then plug this into the wiring harness of the new unit, like that. Then I can have the headliner microphone working directly with the Android side. So like that. Now, keep in mind, this is not a splitter. This is a one-to-one change. So if you do this, and if you're using the microphone on the iDrive side, you're going to lose that. So it's really a matter of choice of which side do you want, to take telephone calls or have a microphone. If you're using your headliner, if you don't, you can use some of the aftermarket options and embed a microphone up here in the center part of your center part of your headliner, that sort of thing. I haven't done that, and I've kept my microphone on the iDrive side. So, but that's how you're going to do that. So the other thing that we can do at this point is pull your display out. OEM and or aftermarket is exactly the same. We've pulled these 2 screws and it just walks up. Now, I'm going to have a couple of extra cables, because this being the Avin 7.1 unit. So I've got a few extra cables than the OEM, where the OEM will only have 1 cable really on the back. This has several. So I've got some extra cable length that I need to work out here, so I can pull this unit up to get it to spin around. And as you can see, it's pretty tight, because when you pack this all in here, all these cables are packed in here really, really firmly. So just keep working it, working it, working it. Your OEM will be a little bit easier, but you're gonna wanna keep working it up to the point you've got enough space that you can turn it around in place and get to the plugs on the back. Your OEM will have 1 plug that comes off. This will have several as I pull it out, but pretty simple. So I'm going to keep working this up. I've got to free some cables, because I've got some cables that are really jammed in here, really, really tight, that are, there we go, that are pinning me down and holding me in place to keep it from coming up. Now, the one other thing, because I've done this already, because like I said, with this unit in, there's a couple of cables that I've already run that I'm going to keep in place. Very specifically, I'm going to keep my USB cables that are already in place. So this plugs to the back of the display, comes down, runs underneath the vent, and if you notice in your glove box, you may have, on the roof of your glove box, you may have a little netting section with these little plastic locks that go up to hold the net. I used to have that. I never used it. If you pull it down and you pull those big plastic blocks out, you're left with the interlock little holes in the roof of your glove box that fits one of those perfectly. So you can actually feed them down through that hole. And actually in this case, I fed this up through the hole. And I've got the USB plug sitting in my glove box. If there's anything I want to plug in, USB thumb drive, external storage, external device, I cannot plug it all in there. So I'm not going to pull this cable out. I wanted to speak to how to install it. Like I said, you run this up through the hole in the top of your glove box. You can reach it, you can reach back behind, pull it through underneath the vents and up to your display. So I'm not going to change that cable today because it's the same cable. So let me keep working this up. As you can see, it's a little tight. Keep working until I get to the point where I can turn around. So I'm gonna get myself a little more cable length. I'm gonna get the display turned around. I'll show you which cable to plug and to unplug if you have the OEM, and we'll swap in the new display. So I want to emphasize one point about the install while obviously I'm still uninstalling. But it's something I want to call out multiple times to make sure that folks are really aware of it. Okay, so a bunch of the extra cables are for this display, but this cable, this kind of purple lavender sort of cable, is the primary data cable that comes up, and this is what you'll have on the back of your OEM display right here. Now, I've spoken with a number of users over time, folks who have done this install, and if you end up with a no signal problem, more often than not, and I've talked to a ton of people with no signal problems, where they're like, I get it all hooked up, and it tells me no signal across the display. This is probably the problem right here, is this cable. So make sure that when you install this, that it is pushed all the way up completely firmly. There's no gap, and I've got a little bit of a gap right now because I've been trying to pull it out. That there is no gap at all, that this plug is in completely firmly, and you'll very likely never see that problem. I mean, and it's a problem that's uncommon at best, right? But almost every time that I've spoken with somebody that has that problem, they get back to me later and go, oh yeah, well, I checked it, I installed it all fine, everything's fine, but then I checked this cable and I pressed on it and then I turned it back on and it worked. So be sensitive to making sure that this cable is plugged in firmly if you get that error. And if you plug it in firmly from the get-go, you won't have that error at all. So I'm going to pull this cable out. These extra cables are because of the Avin unit that's here. This is the GPS antenna, which I'm going to pull out as well. So I'm going to pull all this out, then I'm going to show you how you get the big wiring harness into place. Okay, so I always say I'll make corrections as I go, right? So I'm going to change the primary wiring harness because it looks like it's wired a little bit differently, and I don't want to give myself any problems by using the wiring harness from the previous generation. Again, if you have OEM, you have no problems at all. Now, the other thing that I've noticed, I was going to leave the USB in. Just a second ago, I was just saying that I'm going to leave this USB cable here because I'm just going to reuse it. In this case, I'm not, because here's what I've noticed. The USB cable, which has this smaller 8-pin plug, has the microphone feed on it, right? So here's the microphone feed that we're going to use the redirect off the back of the head unit. But if I look at the new wiring harness, we've got this guy, which is a 12-pin plug, which has all of the extra RCA plugs on it, which I never use, and I never plug in, candidly, because I never use any of these connections. But here's what I notice. There's the microphone. So it's a different wiring harness, right? So the wiring harness has changed or the wiring pinout on the display has changed. I will leave my GPS, the previous GPS antenna. It's exactly the same, so I'll leave this cable here, and I've got the original OEM display cable right there. So I'll leave those there for now. Here's a great opportunity to clean out any dust you've got up here too. So as I described the USB cables a second ago, it is exactly that same process. You're just going to take this, you can see the end of the plug, I fed it up through the holes. So in this case, I'm just going to back this existing one back out and pull it back out of that plug in the roof of the glove box. So it's out. I'll just set that aside. The display is out. So then I'm going to take my USB cables and I'll take that same thing where I'll take the plug and I'll route it up through this hole, and I'll reach in here and I'll just walk it back over and feed it up. So then I'll have the wiring harness and the USB plugs and this expansion bundle here, which you know, if you've got all of these other feeds, you've got, you know, aux video right and left, you've got aux audio, DVR video. I mean, you've got tons and tons of connections here. But what I need in this case specifically is the microphone. So I am going to plug this in. This is going to be fed up as well right here with all of these plugs sitting in between my two vents. So I'm going to take a minute and I'm going to route my USB cable up through here, and then I'm going to rearrange a little bit so hopefully you can see here a little better. This is a really tough space to see into, but the one thing that you're going to want to look for that got me at first is this black and green optical cable. It's a little difficult to see, I'll freely admit. It's right here, this black and green optical cable. If you look at your original wiring harness plug, which should look like this is the original that you have off the back of your head unit. If you haven't installed a display like this before and you've got the OEM screen, it looks like this. Sitting right here is a plug with a black and green, it's a black and green optical cable. You're going to want to very carefully take your plastic trim tool, lift the little tab on the back of this and walk that plug out. And you walk that plug out because you're going to need to transfer it into this. You transfer it in the exact same position right here, this position probably 2 when you look at it, this outside position. It'll snap into place with this little locking tab. When I very first did this, I ended up with a sound problem and I didn't have sound. It was because I didn't realize I had to transfer this green and black optical cable. So I've obviously got it transferred because I have the 7.1 wiring harness here. So I'll pull it out of here and I'll put it into the new one. But I'll show you that in a second. So I'm going to pause. I'm going to route my USB cables up through the vents, and I'll show you about the wiring harness next. Okay, so I'm much closer to what it would look like if you're coming from an OEM place at this point, right? So I've run the USB cable, ran it up through the hole, run it underneath the vent, ran it up right there, right here, the new USB, which is a USB 2.0. I also took this wiring expansion bundle. Obviously, I've got all the plugs sitting right here for right now. I'm going to pull them down and out of the way when I get there, but I've got them up nice and high, so I've got good cable length right here. And this will be all of your RCA ports and your microphone connection as well. Now, let's talk about the microphone adapter, because here it is. So what you're going to do, thankfully, so many of these things are color-coded on the back of BMW items. So look for the color. So blue. Blue is the headliner microphone, if you have it. You lift the little lock. There's a little teeny tiny lock right here on the back when it's plugged in here to the head unit. Lift this little lock and very gently work it up and away from the head unit. Now, in my case, this was incredibly stiff. It took a lot to get off, and actually what I ended up doing was I was kind of wiggling at it, and I was worried about putting too much stress on the cable itself, and I didn't want to pry on the cable. So as I worked on it, I got a little bit of gap, and I took my plastic trim tool and I stuck my plastic trim tool between the body of the plug and the head unit and very gently pried up, and it slowly came away from the head unit. So here it is loose. You're going to want to take this, take your adapter, plug it in straight in here and lock the lock down so it'll stay connected, and then run this up underneath and up and plug it into the headphone jack right here. So you'll take it and you'll run it. You've got a gap here between your vents and the trim. Make sure it's back behind, just like that, and take it and plug it directly in right there. And like I said, we're going to deal with cable management when we're done here, but make sure that you have all your stuff plugged in. Now, the other thing I've got is I pulled that green and black optical cable free of the other wiring harness. I'll hold it up here so hopefully you can see it a little bit better. As you can see, it's black, ribbed black cable on one side and green on the other. It goes only into one position. So here is the end of the new expansion harness. So as you look at the expansion harness, there's an inside place and an outside spot. It goes into the outside spot. It only goes into one orientation because the plug is keyed and it'll lock into place. So it goes into that outside spot. Now, if you don't have this cable, so if you look at your original wiring harness and you don't have this cable, that's okay. Because all that means is that you've got a little bit of a different wiring in your car than I do in mine. I've talked to folks that are like, everything works, but I didn't have that cable, but everything works. You're fine. But if you do have this cable, you're going to need to transfer it. So this is a 2014 F32, so make sure to transfer it if you have it. Now, the one other thing I want to point out is here's our long auxiliary cable. So this is the auxiliary cable. When you look at the new wiring harness, right here is an audio out plug right here on the new wiring harness. Now, you may have to run the auxiliary cable from here to the port under your armrest. Now, it's not hard to do. You can run it underneath the trim. You can pull the bottom of the lining of your, of where your armrest is, pull that up, and there's a bunch of holes in the bottom. You can run the cable up really, really easily and plug it straight into this. The other thing you can do is you can get an aux splitter, that the actual port itself, you pull the port out and where it plugs in at the back, you've got a splitter that will split off and can plug in the splitter and plug it in directly right there. Okay, so I'm not going to show running the aux cable because I don't need to. Now, I wish I knew the secret for those that have to run it or don't. But what I would suggest, and why I want to call it out very early, is that if you haven't installed one of these systems before, you don't know if you're going to need it or not. I wish I could tell you if you need it or not, but here's what I'm going to suggest. Test this once we get it all put together, which we're going to do here in a second. Once we get it all put together, don't put all your trim back on. Don't put it all back together until you test it to make sure you have sound from the Android side. If you do not have sound from the Android side, from the iDrive side comes through the existing wiring harness and the green and black optical cable. If you do not have sound from the Android side, take a set of headphones and plug it, because you haven't put your trim back on, plug a set of headphones into this auxiliary port and see if you have sound from the Android side. If you do, and you don't have it through your speakers, then you know you have to run this cable. You have to run this cable, run it underneath your trim, bring it up underneath the armrest. Like I said, if you want to just plug it into the port or get a splitter, you can. I'm not going to show that part because I don't need to do it. It's not hard, but here's how you also solve that problem, because one of the most common things I get is, I don't have sound from the Android side. Well, did you run the auxiliary cable? No. Well, pull your trim, plug in headphones right here and see if you have sound. And more often than not, I get a yes, I've got sound from the Android side. Play one of the movie samples or an audio track, or stream YouTube for that matter. If you've got sound, that's how it'll fix it. So that between that and making sure your optical cable up here, or your original OEM cable up here is tight, will solve about 99% of the issues I ever see with these installs between these two things. I don't need to install this, so I'm not going to go through those extra steps. Okay? All right, so I've got the new wiring harness. As you can see, we've got lots of extra cables here. There's options for installing a backup camera and all of those things. This works with the OEM camera, so I'm not going to show connecting peripherals or extras I don't have. Okay, so make sure to run this cable behind and up in this gap in your trim, loop it up in front of one of your vents, and then feed it, again, back here through the center. It definitely gets pretty tight, because when you think about it, they cut this space for a single cable, and now we've got a whole bunch jammed up in here. So now pull that up as well. Now we've got, like I said, we've got a bit of a cable management problem right now, especially with this big cable bundle all jammed up in here tight. But as soon as we get the new display plugged in, which is the next step, I'm gonna back all these cables down to get more space and make it a little more friendly, and it's not quite as jammed up quite as badly. Okay? All right, so the next thing you're gonna wanna do is, here is your expansion cable, or daughter cable as I tend to call it off and on. So this is the side that plugs into the OEM plug that's coming up out of your wiring harness down here below. So all you're gonna do, and I'll demonstrate using this cable as the example, right? All you're gonna do is take it and plug it in. It only goes in one way, and cables aren't long enough, but you'll just plug it straight in and lock this horse collar down and in place, and you're good to go. Then take this end with your green and black optical cable in, if you have it, and plug it into the back of your head unit. And at that point, all we need to do is plug in the display, and as far as functionality, you're almost done. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get this cable plugged in, and I'm gonna get my cable straightened out a little bit. I'll show you attaching the display next and settling it back down into place. And then you're in a place where if everything is plugged in, you can test. You can turn your car on, You don't have to worry about having your trim on or anything else like that, though I do plug the stereo buttons, this cable right here, that has your trim piece that has all your stereo controls on it. I plug that back in when I test, but I'll show you that next. Catch up where we are. So the new wiring harness is in. I've got it plugged to the back of the head unit. Like I said, you plug it in and lock that big horse collar down. It's at the bottom. Horse collar should be at the bottom. I also transferred my green optical cable to the plug that goes to the back of your head unit. I've plugged the the female adapter end into the main wiring harness that came up and locked its horse collar down. So all of that's in place. I've run the cabling up through this gap right here between the trim and the vents, run it all the way up. So at this point, we've got all the cables we want to plug in into the back of the display. We've got the primary cable, we've got our USB and accessories cable. We've got the original cable, which sometimes can be a little short, so you can walk your head unit back a little bit to give yourself a little more room. And we have the GPS antenna for the display also. Now the GPS antenna, which like I said, I'm going to use the same one that I have before, but it looks like this. You've got your antenna here with usually some adhesive and or a magnet on the back. And I route it all the way back underneath the center part of the dash over here and just stick it up underneath the bottom. And I have no issues with satellite signal at all. So if you do have an issue, so yet another thing that I see on comments that you've had issues getting a quick GPS lock, there's some great Android utilities for checking signal strength. So you can load one of those utilities, take a look at it, see what your signal strength is, and worst case scenario, with the trim off, you can actually take your antenna and move it around and look at how the signal strength reacts on the display itself to find yourself a place where you have good signal strength. So don't be in a place where you're like, I don't have any GPS signal. Well, it's probably because this is fallen down or is sitting someplace shielded. Okay, so that'll take care of that. It's the same antenna, so it's over there, routed up underneath, and we've got the cable right here. I did want to take this opportunity to show one more thing on the back of the display. Now this is the new one. Here's your little cover right here. So this cover, I will freely admit, is really a challenge to get to when it's installed, because it'll be on this side, it's tucked back behind, it's almost impossible to see. But this is where your micro adapter or micro slot is for memory expansion. Now, obviously this one has not been opened, so I've got the display off camera as I'm trying to get this cover off. This cover is really stiff. So, but if you're going to put in an SD card, put it in now. Now, obviously, if you've got content or something you want to put the content on your SD card, and it goes in the slot here, clicks into place, and then put the cover back on. That's what I'm going to do, because it's really inconvenient to get to once the display is installed. But if you do it now, it's much, much easier. And in this case, this cover is extremely stiff. So trying to do this, yeah, when it was back behind, would be almost impossible. So I'm going to pull this cover off and install my expansion card just into the side here. I don't have anything on it right at the moment, but if you want to install apps to your card and not on the internal memory, all the sort of things, you can do that. There's a million reasons why you may or may not want to do that, but I would put it on now. If you're using it for media, like you've got a big expansion card and you've got a bunch of music files or movie files, copy them now, put them in now, make it easier to put on now. This cover just pulls and snaps out, the card will lock into place, press the cover back into place. This also keeps you from losing the cover. I pulled this cover off one time when I had my dash open like this. I reached back behind, I pulled the cover off, and I dropped it, and it just pinballed all the way down through my interior, and I still have an extra one of these somewhere deep down inside my dash. I never found it again. It's a minor thing, but I will tell you, I'm kind of detail-oriented and meticulous. Every time I walked up to my car and I could see through my windshield, I'd see that cover missing, and it drove me a little crazy. So I would go ahead and use that now, put it in now, like I'm going to do. So I'm going to pause for a second, pull this cover, because it's too stiff to take off my hand right at the moment. I'm going to use my plastic trim tool. I'll install that, and then I'll show you installing the display screen itself next. All in all, we're almost done. That was the stiffest cover I've ever seen on one of these displays, and I've installed several of these now. All right, so I've got my card installed, I've got the cover back on. So here is our display. What I usually do is I'll start with the big plug at the top, because you've got a narrow space to get into right here. So I'll get the big plug in, the lower plugs in, your OEM cable, and your GPS antenna. Okay, so pretty straightforward as we go through this. So you've got all your cabling here. Make sure you got a little bit of extra cable to manipulate all of this. Just take it, and they only go in one way. So you just take this and work it around and get it and slot it into place. You can bend the cable a little bit as we get this. And actually, you know what? In this case, I might do in reverse order. Hold on. Now, they only go into one place, 8 pin, 12 pin, probably what, 30 pin from the looks of it. So I'm going to put the 12 pin in first, which is all of our expansion cables. Get that slotted into place. Should click in, just like that. We've got our 8 pin, key it into place. Yeah, I'm going to do this, like I said, in reverse order in this case, because this cable's big enough now that I think it's going to be a little hard to get to the ones underneath it as we do this. So we'll just bend it around and get it. It's going to be a little hard to see because I'm going to turn the display to get my fingers in here. Take it and work it into place, and there it is, snapped into place. As we go through all of these cables, as I talked about the no signal error, make sure, don't make a really simple mistake and have one of these be loose. So make sure to press on them, make sure that they're snapped into place and the little locking tabs are in place. We've got our GPS antenna right here, which goes right there, like that. And I would imagine you could also use a splitter for the OEM GPS antenna, which is absolutely an option. I don't have a splitter for that, so I'm not going to use it. So, but I imagine you could. So now, here the other thing, like I said, we've got the original cable here, which I'm going to work. So as this turns, you can see how the cable is going to be on this side. So right now it might feel a little awkward, but we're going to rotate this into place as we turn this around. So here is our original OEM cable. It only goes in, or original display cable, excuse me. If you have to, you can walk your head unit back a little bit, so you gain a little bit more cable, getting a little bit more cable length. So here we are looking at the bottom of the display. It only goes in one way as this goes in, which I'm going to bring the cable around to get this up into place. Just like that. Nope, I missed it. All right, so we're gonna get a little bit extra cable length, get this cable bent gently so we can fit it into place, and we will key this into place. Like I said, it only goes in one way, and this cable is heavily keyed to fit in. There it is. Now, when you press this in, make sure, and I'm really pushing my fingers on it, and really, that click was part of my dash, not the plug itself. But make sure that you press really firmly that it's into place. That is the most common cause of issues that I see, is that guy right there. Okay, so everything's plugged in. So now I'm gonna back my head unit back out a little bit. Don't ding up your dash, and start walking these cables down, because we've got a ton of cables all jammed up into the space, and this display needs to sit down further. So this is where we start talking about cable management, right? Kind of like this was a PC, which being an Android system, it kind of is. So as we back all this down, you can see I'm just working all these cables down, working all the cables down until this will sit, and it just sits straight out into place. And it's pretty close right now. As you can see, it's pretty darn close. So all you're gonna do is pull all of these cables down, take all that slack out so it'll sit down nice and straight. So I'm gonna finish that next. I'm gonna get this all down into place, and then we will talk about walking the head unit back into place. You've got a lot of extra cables back here now, or this big cable bundle that was never intended to be there, right? And they really only put in very little extra space, because why would they? They only have their wiring harness, or only the BMW wiring harness. So you kind of have to work at it, and push all the cables back and down and back and down and back and down to work your head unit back in. But I'm gonna work the cables from the display down. I'll show you when that's done, and then we'll talk about working the head unit back in. So like doing a good PC build and making sure your cable management is really, really good. That's essentially what you have to get into here. So now this big accessory cables, all your RCA ports, wiring bundle, you've got a ton of them that I'm not going to use. if you use them, you're gonna have to lay them out differently. In this case, since I'm not gonna use them, I've got some extra space between the tops of the vents and the dash itself, and there's a lot of extra space back in here. So I've taken them and I've tucked them back up into that space. Now here on the left side, the plugs want to drive the vent down a little bit, which isn't good because it's gonna be out of position when you put the trim back on. So just be careful how you do that. The backup backup camera connection and those wires I routed all the way over the top of the vent and off this side because I've got the OEM, and I've got everything else tucked away in the neat places. So when I put the trim back on, it's going to be simple. Now the major part of the wiring harness, I took that, gently pushed it all back in and down, and pulled all, a lot of this extra cabling down and down and down. Pushed it back as far as I could, and then slid the head unit back in, and it slides back in. Now one thing you want to note, these two cables, these are for your trim. Make sure that those did not get pulled down and are tucked away somewhere. I've done that, where I've put it all in, I'm like, I can't find one of these cables. Same thing for your cable that's going to go to your controls right here for your head unit. Make sure that that hasn't gotten pulled away or is tucked behind the head unit somehow. So take all of this and slide it back into place. There are these two posts on either side. You just slide it back and slide it back. Get to the point where it will fit back into place and should fit flush with your mounts. If you're halfway stuck out, then pull it back in. Take your wiring harness, push it further back in, try to tuck it in and down, and try again to get it to fit. This is going to be a matter of patience to get it to a place where it's going to connect, right? So or not connect, but it's going to fit back into place really, really well. If it's, halfway out, don't smash it back into place, because that means you've got cables that are pulling in, you might pull cables apart, you might pull if you're using the microphone adapter, you might pull that off. I mean, be gentle and patient in this process, because I've gotten better at this over time, go figure, right? But initially, I got my head unit, it was probably halfway out of the dash, and it just I hit something solid and it wouldn't move. So, keep just being patient, keep working at it, get it over those two posts, connect it back in. And in this case, I'm almost flush left and I got a little bit of gap right. So I'm gonna pull it back out and settle and try to push the cables on the right side in and down a little bit more, and it should be okay. There is just enough room to get this installed. The other thing that I did is I also put the two of the T20 Torx bolts back here into the display up here at the top to help hold this into place as I'm pulling all these cables, so I didn't knock it loose or have it sit funny. I got it in and flush really nice, got all these cables pulled down, and I put those two in to hold it in place. I also always make sure to put these two bolts in pretty snugly, because you don't want this moving and squeaking at all. So have those in nice and snug, so you don't have to deal with that. So this is the point I say, like I said, be patient, work it back into place. I'm going to pull the head unit back out, work on the right side, tuck it back down here a little bit, and then slide it back into place. Once that's done, you can test. As I mentioned before, and I'll mention again, about the auxiliary cable, the aux cable. You may need this. I never have in any of the generations of the Avin displays I've installed. I've just gotten lucky that way. But this is the point where your aux cable, you would have wanted the aux that's coming off your wiring harness, you would want to pull it up, pull it up into some place like up here on the top of your vents where you can get to it. So in case you need to test. Then all you would have to do is take your trim at this point. So work your head unit back into place. It doesn't even have to be secure. You can take your controls, you can plug your controls back in right here and just hang this gently in place, and you can turn your car on to test. So I'm going to work my head unit back into place. Make sure that it's sitting flush. I'm going to put 1, 2, 3, 4 of the bolts to hold this back into place back in. And then we'll talk about testing, turning the car on, making sure it works. And at that point, if everything works, it's just putting everything back together. And you can see how easy this install was. There's no reason to pay an installer to do this when you can do this yourself with one tool, with a T20 Torx driver and a little bit of patience. Okay, so I've gone ahead and put my center trim back on. So like I said, I've plugged it in from this side. You can just hang it in place and it'll sit on kind of these posts but I also don't like if it falls off, and I don't want it to bang up my trim or bang up this piece at all. So I went ahead and put the 4 T20s in to help hold it in place. I also have my lower trim panel down here, which, like I said, I've got a little bit of extra wiring that you may not have. The extra wiring is for the LCI, this LCI trim addition that I added that has lights around the inside, just like you have in your door panels. And I think it's just gorgeous. It's one of the most things that easiest things to see as you drive around at night. And I didn't do a DIY video. It was one of the very first mods I did on this car. I probably should have done a DIY video on it. But all you have to do is you just buy the piece, and if you have the lighting package, so if you have this lower trim piece right here, has the light in it, and you have the lighting package, then you've got the plug that you need right here. And if you check out like BIM Repost forums or other places, there's some really great guides on how to build, because basically you're just going to build a Y. You're going to build a Y wire with a male at one end and at the other end a male and female to plug in, so you can plug this piece in. It works perfectly with as you dim your lights or change your color. I always run in the amber instead of the sport, which is the white. But this piece, it does both the amber, does the classic and the sport. And so you can do both, not at the same time, but you can do either color, and it ties in perfectly like it was meant to be here. So I'm just going to tuck a little bit of these extra wires out of the way as we get this in place. So that's why I have some wires that you may not. I probably should have done a DIY video on it, but I didn't, and that was a couple of years ago. And I love this addition. So just take it, secure the bottom, hook the bottom, and just push it up into place. So now at this point, the only thing that you've got off is the center trim with your hazard lights and door locks, and you're not going to get any errors or anything if you start the car with this unplugged. So I always test first to make sure that I haven't done something wrong, I haven't missed a plug, that I've got sound from the Android side, that I've got sound from the iDrive side, all of those things before I put my center console dash back together. It only takes a few seconds to do so, but I'm also careful with the pieces as well, and I don't want to bang them up. So let me clean up my cables a little bit, then we're going to fire up the car and get that first initial start. I've got a little bit of background reflection today, so it might be a little bit hard to see, but I'm going to do the best that I can, and we'll get that first startup going and test everything, because before you put it all back together, you want to make sure to test. So let me do a little bit of cleanup, and then we're going to do that. Guys, so here's the moment of truth here. So everything's plugged in. Let's bring power up, and we will bring this system up. So there's a tremendous amount of configuration that you can do on these devices, and likely will need to do depending on your car. So I'll touch on those a little bit. I'm planning on doing a follow-up video to really walk through and zoom in really closely on the display itself and walk through all of its functions. But I just want to talk about a high level right now. Okay, so good sign. So I'm going to pause sound there for a second. So that would be the audio side of the Android. So I have sound. I didn't need to run the aux cable. This would be your test that if you didn't have sound, plug in your headphones. So that's music from the Android side, and it works just fine. I'm going to pause it because anytime you have audio or video from other sources, YouTube likes to freak out on you. So I'm going to try to avoid that and have them not flag my video for copyright things, right? So music works. We've got navigation, Bluetooth. Now, I haven't launched the navigation on this side yet. Like I said, this is a brand new setup. So there's a lot of configuration to do. Interesting. I'm trying to, right now, I'm trying to see where it thinks I am. All right, well, we'll work that out. But like I said, this is a very first start, right? So your first start, you have to walk through setting up, putting in your Android or your sign in and your login so you can get into the Play Store and all those things. I haven't done any of those things yet, right? So you can scroll. Car info is your original iDrive side. Let me backtrack and go here to say radio, which works just fine. Everything's still working. Okay, I'll pause that before I get in some trouble on copyright sort of things. So as we look at the tiles, and this is the iDrive 6 tile set: music, navigation, Bluetooth, video, car info, browser, web browser, file manager, DVR, dashboard, phone link, apps, and settings. Now, I'm going to do a detailed walkthrough, but obviously we're up and running. Touchscreen works, power works, everything else works. Now, I came from the 8.8-inch display. So one thing I do want to call out so you don't have an initial, oh no, what's wrong, right? So if you go into settings and you go down to system info, factory setup, you've got to enter a code. The code is 1314, okay. And this will get you into some really critical factory settings. Now, there's a ton of things in here that we can go through, and I will go through another time, but the thing I want to focus on right now is initial setup. So down the left-hand side, you've got car type. Go to your car type. So if you have the 6.5-inch screen, the iDrive screen is too small for a screen that's almost twice as big. So if they stretched it, it would look terrible. So if you've got a 6.5-inch screen, the iDrive is going to sit in about 3/4 of the screen, and then they've got an information screen that will fill the other side. That way you don't end up with really, really terrible distortion. Now, if you come from the 8.8-inch screen and you already had that, and you've got the 1/2-inch screen, like, because when I first started up, it came up here as option number 1, which is the F48, F49, 6.5 half screen. So when I went to the iDrive side, I had it all. I had the information screen on one side and my iDrive only in about 2/3 of the screen. So go into settings, code 1314, car type, and go to the F48, F49, 8.8-inch, so 10.25 screen, so full screen. So you just do that, you double tap on it, it'll ask if you want to change the model selection, you say yes, that'll solve the problem. A lot of the settings in here are double tap. It took me a little while to figure that out. And like I said, there are a ton of settings in here that you can go into. I'm not going to go into them for detail today, but we are running. So I'm going to hit back and back and back, and we're going to be back at this main tile screen. As you can see, we're up and running. Everything's great. We've got sound from all sides. So now it's going to be the point where I go through and I start configuring. I start setting up my Wi-Fi, and I set up my Bluetooth and contacts, and set up my logins for Google Play, and update my apps, and all of those things that you're going to need to do. But that's where you're going to want to start next. But that's beyond our install and initial setup. But I really wanted to stress your screen, because I do get a lot of that, it's distorted, or it looks like garbage, it looks really bad. Well, you have to make sure to have the right screen selected for your iDrive for it not to be a problem. Okay, so at this point we have sound from the Android side, we have sound from the iDrive side, the screen is set up properly so it looks right. So at this point you're done. Congratulations, it should look really good and is a huge difference. One thing that you could potentially do if you're coming from a 6.5-inch screen, it is possible to have someone code your car. So they'll come in and code your car and tell it that instead of the 6.5-inch screen, it had the 8.8, and then you could get full screen here. But that's not something you can do with this display. That is a separate thing you need to do to contact someone in your area who can do coding like that. There are some companies that do remote coding, but it is possible. And as a side note, if you have an F-Series car, the things you can code in your car are phenomenal. And I used a local service, a great gentleman who's become a friend who does coding, and I have probably 25 different things coded differently in my car. Not display, mind you, because I came from the 8.8, but I have coded a tremendous number of things different in my car that are really, really great. So I recommend it in general. But to answer that question that I also often get, if you have the 6.5, it is possible to code your car to the 8.8, but that's a separate thing you're going to need to do for that to work. Okay, so we should be pretty much good to go. Now I've got to configure the display and do all the things I need to do to get it ready for me, but the install is done. As you can see, this wasn't hard. There's no reason why you couldn't do this work yourself and save yourself that time and effort and trouble, and especially cost, to have an installer do it when it really isn't that hard. So I'm going to put my center dash back in. All you need to do is pull this up. Now, the one thing that I frequently will do is this center button is, for whatever reason, is really hard to get to. So if you're struggling with this, and it's this cable right here, now I'll give it one shot as I sit here to see if I can get it in, because sometimes I'll get lucky and I'll get the cable in here on my first attempt, which is usually not the case. So we'll see if I can get this plugged into place. Maybe. Well, it's my lucky day today. All right, well, I got lucky today and it plugged right in. So I don't normally get that lucky. But what you also can do is if you depress the tab here on the back of the switch itself, you can push the switch out the front and then pull the cable through, plug it into the switch because it's nice and easy, and then push the switch back into place. I do that more often than not. I just got really, really lucky today. So that will be that. And then we have there we go. We've got our other controls. So when you take this and you rock it back into place, just take this, let me pause our sound here. It just rocks back into place. And this is where you want to make sure you don't have any cables that are sitting between your vents and your trim, so your trim will mount back in properly. So it just pushes back into place. You've got that narrow, thin end at the other end. Gently snap that back into place, and you're done. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Okay, all done and cleaned up. As you can see, this is a really simple install. It takes really only a couple of tools in less than an hour, and you can install this in your car. There's no reason to pay somebody else to do this when you can do this work yourself and save that time and money. So this is a significant upgrade for your car. If you're coming out of the OEM 6.5 or 8.8 inch screen, this 10.25 makes a huge difference. And then you get all the added functionality of the Android 8.1 side of apps, streaming video, different navigation choices, which really, really can be an advantage for you in your car. I want to thank my partner Avin for this. I've been working with them for years and they make a fantastic product. I'm really looking forward to working with this further now that it's installed into my car. If you like what you've seen, please click like. Also the little alert button next to it. That way you'll get notifications when I have new videos coming out, and I have a whole bunch of additional projects on my bench that I'm really excited to get to and show to you when I get to them. Thanks so much, and I look forward to seeing you on my next project.